Feeling thirsty for knowledge? Hackers on the Rocks is the podcast that mixes refreshing conversation with potent cybersecurity insights. Serving up these insights with a twist, we pair a different software vulnerability with a refreshing cocktail recipe each episode. All right, hello world and greetings all around. Our opening segment is called Get Handle Information, and here to bring you today's drink, our guest, Olivia Gallucci. Olivia, what are we drinking?
We're drinking White Monster.
Yeah, so welcome to the show. And I have a White Monster, and I'm not a soda drinker, so I went to the Monster aisle. Apparently, there's a whole aisle now in the shopping centers, and there's a lot of variety. So why the white one?
Yeah, so my father's drink was White Monster, and so I want to honor my dad so that he knows I'm cool enough to be on a podcast.
Yeah, hey, here's to honoring dads. Hi, Dad.
Yeah, yes.
All right, while we're cracking this open, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the cybersecurity research field.
Yeah, so hi, my name's Olivia Gallucci. I recently graduated from the Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. My whole goal ever since I knew I wanted to do the general field of technology was really giving back to the open source software community. I learned a ton from them. They really supported me and my growth, and everyone that did that was anonymous online. It was through Reddit, the Debian community, and all of that. And people were just spending hours helping me debug and learn how to code. And so I really liked that. And then while I was on an airplane, I was watching the documentary about the anonymous hacker group, and I was like, yep, that I want to do open source offensive security. And through the years, I ended up working at a bunch of places. I did offensive security at Apple, the US government, and Deloitte. And I realized that macOS internals was something that I really liked and really enjoyed. And I was just kind of like, okay, a lot of people don't understand, Apple's proprietary systems. I do. And this is a really great area for me to bring, openness and, knowledge to the space. And so that's how I got into security research.
Yeah, I dig it. I guess I'll have to ask, since we're liking anonymous. What's your favorite anonymous story?
Oh, it was the 2011 or 2019. I think it was the Egyptian internet shutdown. Anonymous hackers went in. Yeah, it was 2011, I believe, or I'm not sure the year. Someone Google it. But it was essentially where these hackers got medical supplies and information through printers and whatnot, like how to help people, uh, you know, with medical care while soldiers were barging into people's homes and all of that. And they were printing instructions on how to get your internet back up and running, how to get help in certain situations. And I thought that was really admirable, because when someone shuts down the whole internet and then just begins attacking civilians, especially if that's a government, that's going to be hard to do. And I just thought it was pretty baller for them to go in and try to help people like that.
Yeah, fair enough. A lot of causes. All right, so one thing we tend to do on the show is do a quick cheers. So I'm going to raise my can. I see you've poured yours into a
Cheers.
glass. Cheers, and
Yes.
let's try this thing.
Awesome. Sounds good. Yeah, I poured mine into a glass because my computer's on top of my laundry basket because I recently moved. So
This
I
is
promise it's Monster though.
this is it can be, hey, it can be whatever you want it to be. It's the internet, right? Everything's true. This is tasty. Actually, I did not think that I would like it. Yeah. All
Yeah.
right. So, all right. Do you consume stereotypically, right? You must have 10 of these cans a day. Is that how this works?
No, see, I try to treat caffeine like a drug. So when I drink caffeine, it's usually when I have to wake up really early to do a half marathon or something. And I don't, do the whole pre-workout thing and whatnot, but it's if I have to drive 2 to 4 hours and I have to wake up, at 3 a.m. to go drive, I have 4 hours of sleep. Let me drink the Monster, okay? So I do have a huge stash of them, but I treat them like little drugs, for when I need to drive really early.
I, I feel like I should take this as a sign of honor that we're effectively doing your equivalent of drugs together on air. I love this. It's a special occasion. So thank you.
Of course.
Today's episode is sponsored by Personum. Generating and collecting network traffic is easy. In many regulated industries, it's required. But what are you doing with that stored data? Personum.ai offers detection as code that allows you to sift through your network data looking for behavioral abnormalities. Build and even monetize threat detection solutions from data you are already collecting with Personum. Find out more at personum.ai. All right, our next segment is called The Distillery. Olivia, tell us, what are we going to talk about today?
Sure, we're going to be talking about TOCTOU attacks, which stands for time of check to time of use.
All right, that's a lot of words. I've seen TOCTOU as an acronym, and that's a lot of letters. So, anything more than PHP is confusing to me. So, what is time of check to time of use?
Yeah, so this attack exploits the gap between when a system checks a resource, like a file's existence or permissions, and when it actually uses that resource. So if I were to make a malicious change in that tiny window of time, I could try to trick that process into executing or loading untrusted code instead of, something legitimate.
Yeah, and so maybe let's start with the macro. Like, can you give us some kind of an example of like an application that could be vulnerable in this approach?
Yeah, so pretty much anything can, like if you're checking permissions, if something simply has permissions and you can check them, right, that's where it could occur. Also, if you were to check the existence of a file, anything that you can check the existence of, that is where this could occur too, because it's always going to take a system time to do that. It's just how much time is it going to take? Can you test that amount? Can you find that amount of time? And can you predict within that window where you could change something? Of course, there are a couple more steps to it. For example, are there any permissions you need to disable, like system integrity protection or whatnot, if you're doing this on Mac OS? Uh, there'd be different ones for, web servers and whatnot. But that's pretty much the gist of it. And these attacks are really prevalent. And it's kind of weird because not I don't really see always that many people talking about them, but they're very common these days. Like in February, there is I think two or three just in Mac OS alone. Like there was an unpatched parallel desktop flaw that got root on Mac OS, as well as like a race condition, which TOCTOU is a type of race condition in a way, in the macOS kernel, which is XMU, where someone was able to escalate privileges, corrupt memory, and do like kernel level code execution.
All right, so I'm hearing a couple things, right? I'm hearing that they're very common, but it sounds like they're not well understood. I guess is that because they're forms of race condition, and race conditions in general are not understood? Like, why? How can they be common but also not understood? It feels like if it's common, everyone would know about it, and if it's not common, it becomes more esoteric.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I think people are just now learning how to do these types of tests. And I think it was just like a very neglected bug class. I think people don't understand race conditions that well. I think people are often like looking, just like pure memory stuff. They're like, oh, like, I see, someone's doing like a buffer overflow or, heap overflow or something. And all of those things are what we're taught about in school. It's what we watch YouTube videos on. Who's talking about TOCTOU attacks? So I think just the existence of it is something that you kind of have to know about in order to check if a system has it. Because who is just going to be, checking the timing between random system processes unless your work relies on like latency, you know?
Got it. All right. So to me, then it sounds like maybe for the future, right? I think I just read like we're either at the 25th or 30th anniversary of, the smashing the stack for fun and profit. It sounds like you might be authoring or should be authoring the equivalent in race condition land. Is that maybe something on your horizon?
I'm not sure about that. I will say it was quite interesting the amount of people like senior and staff researchers who like in the Mac OS space and in the proprietary system space who reached out to me and they're like, thank you so much for this resource. Like this is the first time I've heard about this. And I was kind of shocked because all of a sudden like the amount of people that were sharing this post and whatnot, I automatically became an expert in something that I just wrote a little blog post about. And the reason why I wrote this blog post was because I got into like an argument with someone at DEF CON. And I was like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And I was like, I'm just going to go write about it to go, prove like what I'm saying is like correct here. And from that, it really just took off. And I realized I was like, whoa, people people need to learn about this more. But yeah, I think that's why people now think I'm an expert in this space.
Yeah, you've taken up the microphone, you've run with it, right? So I think, look, memory corruption it's dead, right? I'm hearing Rust is the solution to everything. So I don't know that there's a universal solution to race conditions or TOCTOU. So I guess, all right, you mentioned that there are now tests. So maybe can we talk a little about like how can one test? Like how do you from the outside figure out like if something is vulnerable to this kind of a race condition?
Yeah, so there's quite a few things that you can do. So like if you're outside of the code base, or you're outside like a system, you can start by searching for split operations. So like any place that you see a call to like stat, a permissions check, or a string comparison on a path, followed later by that same function by like open, exec, or fopen. So automatic code scanning tools like I'm not sure which ones will test it, but like there's some automated like code scanning tools can try to flag these patterns. They're not always the best though. And then in live systems, and this is where I personally try to do it the most. It's like you can monitor for unexpected rename, unlink, or excessive iNotifier FS events. And these glitches that will correlate usually with legitimate processes that are trying to access files. So some things that you can do if you're on the system already, you can try to monitor the target process's system calls, say with like strace or trace, to detect when it checks, say like a configuration file or some random file. And as soon as you see that check, you can automatically replace the real file with a malicious one. And then when that process next opens, it might, unload, sorry, not unload, it might load your code. And this kind of sounds like some sort of symlink attack. And although I guess they can be similar in how they operate, they're two distinct things.
All right, so let me make sure I'm understanding right. So now let's talk a little bit like drilling into code. So back in my computer science days, it was there's you're writing code and these are just three or four successive lines of right if file exists, right, then open it, and if you open it, then write to it, right, just
Mm-hmm.
hypothetically, right. And so from my view as a programmer, these things are happening very linearly in a straight order, this then this then this. And if I'm hearing you correctly, that's not that doesn't work anymore because something can intercept in the middle, right? It might be in like a millisecond or a nanosecond, but there are ways to kind of hijack in the middle. Am I getting that right?
Yep. And it is happening really fast. Like it's super fast. I don't think it's something that we as humans, right, would like detect really quickly. But the computer is doing tons of calculations, and like if you just look at Mac OS logs, like you run like a log like receiver for like a second, and you have like a couple hundred like ESF events, and so that can happen. And so those small bits of time is really the window that you have to do something like this. And it's still a window. It's just really tiny.
Yeah. And so is I'm extrapolating here, but it sounds like the window exists because even though me as the programmer, open file, write to it is two lines of code, write one after the other. The reality is that the processor, like there could be multiple threads, or there could be multiple processors, or the operating system has all these software processes to manage, and in real time, it's not the computer itself, the CPU is not just doing open and then write. There's other things that are also happening. Is that getting it kind of
Yep.
right? Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
so now, all right, now I'm super interested, right? So I'm an attacker and I've got like a millisecond, right? So how do I get myself in the right place at the right time to do something about this?
Yeah. So you need to write something to detect when a file is being checked. So as soon as it checked, you automatically replace that real file with the malicious one. And you kind of write a program to do that for you, because like if you were to manually try to hit a button and
Yeah,
do it,
hit
like
the
it
enter key at exactly the right millisecond. Yeah.
yeah, like that's just
Yeah.
not going to work. And so uh, that's you usually just write a program to check that check, and there becomes some complications because you're checking the checking of the file, right, could be too slow, and so there's kind of you sometimes have to do it a couple of times in order for it to work properly, or at least that's what I have to do, because uh, I don't necessarily know how to make my programs fast enough to beat the computer's checks.
Got it. All right. So that to me sounds why this might be esoteric and not as understood as a buffer overflow, right? With a buffer overflow, I can conceptualize the buffer as a contiguous range of memory, and I can put stuff in that buffer, and I can move a point. Like, but it sounds like for me, this is much more of a timing attack, which makes sense. That's what the
Yes.
T's stand for in TOCTOU. And there is not today a really clean tool or technique to insert that. But let's wave the magic wand, and we've got our timing down. Explain to the audience, I now have arbitrary right. Like I can if a program is trying to open up a file for purposes, right? And the classic example that I always remember from my education days is like the ATM, right? I just want to check the balance of the account, and if there's enough money, pull out, and if there's not enough money, you can't, or whatever. Um, how what what exactly could an attacker do when you say insert a file or insert an instruction or something um, that would, like, what's the impact, right? Like if there's a TOCTOU vulnerability present, like how bad can it be?
Yeah. So as a prefix to this, it's not just files. Like I've only talked about files and stuff right now, like permissions and all that, but you can also check things like environment variables. You know, some programs will check these environment variables like a path early on, which paths are usually to files, right? And then later load those executables or shared libraries. And then by, prepending your own directory or something, you can then slip in a malicious something, or binary into that TOCTOU gap. So you can do this in a variety of ways. So the impact can range from privilege escalation, where you trick a root process into running your malicious code, to data leakage or integrity violations. For example, a backup script might check that it's writing to /backups and then later write to a file. A TOCTOU attacker, I guess, like someone who's trying to use this vulnerability here, could then swap in a symlink to Etsy Shadow or something in the interim, and then exfiltrate password hashes. However, it can be so much worse than that. Like the Parallels example, like of course you had to have the Parallels virtual machine software and installed on your machine, but like you could then get the vulnerability in that software and then get root on the Mac.
Yeah,
And
Docker
and that could
had a
be great.
similar one fairly recently, where a malicious virtualized container was able to allow the ability to break onto the overall host. Um, okay, got it. All right, so now, so it's pretty it's broad, right? So I can read things that I shouldn't have access to. I can slip in data to places which could then either inject code or inject access. That sounds pretty darn severe. And it sounds like they're fairly ubiquitous, right? And I did a little bit of research before, we started talking, and I think the one that I just kind of gravitated to, just because it's generally in the news, is a Tesla Model 3 had one where there
Yeah.
was a timing issue, and I guess all the ECUs could get kind of linked together, and an attacker could arbitrarily like mess with the sensor readings, or force functions to happen, deploy airbags, hit the brakes, that kind of stuff. So pretty powerful, these timing attacks. um,
Yeah,
and
and
so
they're everywhere.
yeah, and so maybe just towards closing, if we can talk a little bit. You talked a little bit about like pattern recognition, right? If you're seeing a open and then a write, or you see like an open and then a stat or something, like system call tracing type stuff. What kind of patterns would you look for, or what what things might be indicative of an area that a researcher would want to kind of experiment with.
Yeah, so you'll probably want to search for, split operators, so things like stat, any sort of permission checks, and this will depend based on the language that you're using. So, each language has functions to, do a type of check. Each operating system has like its own thing that it's doing. So, like Mac OS uses like Objective C, so there's ways to, set up ways of trying to check these things, and so you want to search for where you're doing permission checks, any sort of comparisons on paths, anything, manipulating or surrounding paths, anything trying to change an environment variable, anything that would just be, you know, on the system that needs to be checked. And another thing to look at are just simple like functions like open, exec, or fopen. And so those are just really common ones. Like when you're learning, CS1 and CS2, like you're going to read from your CSV file and whatnot. So those are some, and then you can also find like renames or unlinks or inotifies/fs events. So anything that's really checking system behaviors or reading from system behaviors or accessing system behaviors, that will usually be a good pattern to look at. And of course, it would be kind of time intensive, but most of the time when you're looking at a file, you probably have some knowledge of that file to begin with, or a reason for why you're looking at it. So these patterns then become pretty clear and almost obvious if you just have almost like a checklist of what to look for.
Yeah, I guess so. One thing that comes to mind then is the ongoing debate between like a bug and a vulnerability, and it seems like these bugs are common. I think you've already kind of shouted out how common these things can be, and I think we listed out a couple of examples, and there's probably several more. It seems like finding these things, like reproducing them in practice, you've got these small time windows. It's non-deterministic. It's really hard to reproduce. Um, but when an exploit is able to be produced, that the impact can be really large. I guess help me reconcile this of like if I'm on the vulnerability management side and like is are these like highly exploitable, or is this like if there's a million a million log4j's out there and only one of them will get hit in practice, therefore I should focus my attention elsewhere as a defender?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I was unfamiliar with this debate between like a bug and a vulnerability, because the idea that I understood vulnerabilities is that you can't the vulnerability. If you take like Casey John Ellis's like getting punched in the face example, the vulnerability is that you can't currently move because you're being blindsided, right? That was what the vulnerability is. It was like a weakness. That said, when it comes to weaknesses with TOCTOU attacks, it often becomes a software vulnerability. So it starts with a software issue that has access, like, sorry, it starts with a software vulnerability that has elevated privileges. So the software itself or something within it will have elevated privileges. And then you will get access to the software through poor programming practices and whatnot, and then get those elevated privileges from there. And as a result, if you're not going, through kind of this chain of, steps with vulnerable software, or with a vulnerable, like an explicitly vulnerable piece of code that already exists, it can be really difficult to have a full workflow with these attacks. Like for me, like I did disable SIP, I did disable all these, security controls that, try to stop attackers. And, most people on Mac aren't going around aren't going around, just disabling SIP. They're not doing that. And so you have to figure out a way to either disable it yourself through a certain way of doing that. You can, take examples from Accept, right, where they'll, pop up a permission box, and you don't try to convince the user to just click disable, or, fake, dialog box to get them to do that. If you're not doing some sort of social engineering thing through that, though, you're going to be stuck with trying to find bugs yourself, which I feel like can be a lot more difficult, and I don't think is often used as much unless you're a researcher sitting down and looking at these things for a living.
So something you just mentioned strongly applies if I'm now a developer and I want to release product that is has this this vector kind of mitigated effectively. I heard you say design for least privileges, which is just broad, but logical. Any other advice that you would give to a developer or product manager to try and ensure that their code does not allow for someone to inject maliciousness between time of check and time of use?
Yeah, so the first would probably be to use like atomic descriptor based APIs. For example, OpenAT with like I think it's like no Excel or like no OFollow or something. There's certain tags and like setups that you can use with atomic descriptor based APIs. So you want to check and use happen in a single syscall. I'd also want to, try to minimize privileged code paths. So only elevate permissions when you absolutely need to, right? And then drop them immediately after. So it's unfortunate that like these things still continue to happen, but like people make mistakes. So people would look at my code, for example. I'm not a developer, but like I make these mistakes. I mean, most people aren't. I don't make software, but like these are things that I do because I'm lazy. You just close the file at the very end of your program, like that's just what people do. And then next, I'd probably try to adopt a security by design mindset, which is so overused, but if you're someone who is actually a software developer or a program manager, like trying to just look for when is a file opened, when is a file closed, how long does this have to be open for? Like that's something to try to check, right? And then any sort of automated scans that could try to detect this, of course, would probably be a given. And then lastly, I think trying to combine things like privilege separation, code signing, sandboxing, and mandatory access controls what would be really good because that's kind of where the defense of TOCTOU attacks comes in. It's these defenses that were already built into the machine, and these defenses are usually pretty good and pretty strong because you know everyone is trying to go at them all the time, and people are usually trying to fix and keep those up to date.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to ask one follow up question. Because we get this quite a bit on the show where someone says, "Oh, the developer just needs to use like this version of print instead of that version of print or whatever." And the question is, well, then why don't we just deprecate the unsafe one and use the safe one? So if I'm trying to open up a file and best practice is to use this OXL or exclude or whatever that I don't know how to pronounce it OEXCL, that flag.
Yeah.
If that provides some level of atomic operation, um, is there any reason why all developers shouldn't just always use that? And if so, why is it why is it discretionary? Why isn't it just built in and mandatory?
Well, so I'm not actually quite sure the answer on that one. What I would say though, like there's always that question of like why don't people update their servers? Well, people might be relying on those servers, like something critical might be running, and the same could be said with the software that's actually running on them. So what my guess would be something under the lines of like we don't have the ability to update them right now, or there might be specific use cases where having a delay between opening and closing a file might be necessary. And at that point it then becomes like you have to really just care about who are you giving access to that machine, is it going to be open to the internet and all that, and then you have to kind of mitigate those risks that way. But I bet there are issues of just or reasons to not use these flags. It's just they're not reasons I know.
Fair enough. All right. One final question before we wrap up. I think the current feeling as we record this is that vibe coding is the future and just let the machines write it. And it sounds like, if I'm understanding everything that you've said today, you have to be really thoughtful in your code, considering again multiprocessor, distributed systems, synchronous access, or simultaneous access from multiple. Like, there's a lot going on here to build a system that is resilient against these kinds of vectors, even if the exploitability window is milliseconds. Um, does it? I guess I don't know what the question is, but like vibe coding and how this would work. Like, can AI at this point help developers minimize this, or are they would you feel like AI would just introduce more of these kinds of attacks in future applications?
I mean, 100% to both. Allie Diamond recently made like a TikTok on a problem. It was essentially saying how she was talking about some study that found that ChatGPT will give you fake like imported libraries around 25% of the time, 20 to 25% of the time. I found on average. And people just, take that stuff and use it. And that's kind of what the whole idea behind vibe coding is, right? And so if that's just, the libraries, I'm sure, people are like we said, you learn in CS class that, you open the file at the beginning when you need it, and then you close it at the very end of the program, right? So I'm sure, the AI is probably learning from these really bad practices. So of course it is going to introduce it. However, I love AI. I truly do. I think it's wonderful. If there's a whole thing of code, like if I have a file of code and I'm like, oh, I'm slating the work that, like, I'll pop that thing into, my work approved AI, and I'll be like, hey, document this code for me, explain this line by line what it's doing. And it makes that code a lot easier to read. And at that point, if you're able to understand what the program is doing, it really just becomes knowing the language that you're looking at, knowing that you have to be looking for, file paths, environment variables, and various other things, and then just seeing, could this code be moved up? Like, could we close this file before continuing with the rest of these operations? Like, does this have to be open the entire time? And I think it could really help with that and stream that process. You just have to then rely on developers to actually be looking at their code in that way, which might not be smart.
For those that are not watching the video feed, there's a huge smile on Olivia's face right now as she says this. All right, last call, Olivia. Where can people go to find out more about you, your work, or anything you mentioned today?
Of course, yeah. I highly recommend going to oliviagalucci.com. And if you want to hear more about, anything we've talked about today, you can just search a keyword or two and all of my blog posts will come up. You can also find me on X and on LinkedIn and GitHub and pretty much all the standard social media sites that are not video based, but maybe sometime in the future I'll do a YouTube or something. And yeah, but blogs my main pace. So thank you so much for having me on your show.
Yeah, thanks for a lot. Thanks a lot for teaching us about time of check, time of use today. I know the audience appreciated it. I appreciate it. I learned a ton. So thank you for your time. Catch you later. Cheers.